so that we have this, and I'll share my screen. And then we should be good to go, I think. So without further ado, I'll leave it up to the presenters for today to lead you through.
Hi, everybody. So Caroline asked me and Rachel to talk about a couple of things today. The first part was Unity Day that's coming up, and I apologize for my voice. I've had a cold for like 2 weeks now. My voice still is not back. Unity Day, for anyone who doesn't know, is going to be October 26th from 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock. And we have, okay, where do I do that? Shall we?
So just do this right there.
That's fine.
Yeah. And then see the little pictures. Sorry.
All right, that's okay. That's all right. So we've had a lot of student involvement with preparing for Unity Day this year. It's going to be October 26th from 10 until 2. Political Science Club and PTK are putting on a Voting 101 workshop. There also is going to be a student-led What Citizenship Means to You presentation and conversation. There's a Unity luncheon that PTK is, they've donated the money so that we could have a Unity luncheon. And then we're going to have Adil Mansour, who's presenting a workshop on identity and the transformative powers of art. Art is being used in a broad term. Adil's workshop deals with art in the sense of art, but also with poetry and also with theater and also with photography. It's a really good workshop. So that's Unity Day. If anybody has any questions about that, feel free to ask them, but it should be a really nice day. And so please encourage your students to come. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about with everyone was best practices. And so one of the things that I think is a best practice in terms of how we can talk about diversity and inclusion in our classroom is the idea of culture and the idea of the multiculture in the classroom. And so when I use the word culture, it's thinking about culture in a dynamic and fluid sense, which is more than just ethnicity, more than just race, more than just ability or disability. The idea of culture that is dynamic and fluid and focuses on the students who are in the classroom and ways to think about their identities and to use that knowledge to create a classroom community, and how to bring that that knowledge of who you have in the classroom into the academics that also are in that classroom. And so really it works as part of the development of a socio-political consciousness that is not limited to just the classroom and just that semester. It's a way of thinking about who you have in the classroom and what you're teaching and how to use that information to...
It's just the way it is.
To craft your lessons. And so, you know, there's some research behind that, so I'm just going to kind of go through these slides quickly. There's some research behind that. If anybody wants to hear about the research in more detail, I'd be happy to go through that. But one of the things that I pulled for this came from some icebreakers from Villanova University, and so I brought some for the people in the classroom. And I also, I also put a link on this slide for anybody who was interested in it. But this is just a kind of a 10-minute icebreaker that you could use in a classroom: dimensions of identity, circles of my multicultural self. And so the way that this one works is
before the conversation, please make sure you're muted. Hear somebody like eating some chips.
They're typing.
this. And I have your PowerPoint.
Oh, no, that one I can't.
Yeah, that was weird.
I think we're all right now.
Okay,
Sorry.
that's all
I
right.
think I got everybody. I'll hide that so it's each side.
Okay. So with this one, you put your name in the center circle, and then each of the circles around it, you put in different facets of your ways that you would define yourself. So if I were giving an example in a classroom, I might put Italian American in one of the circles. I might put parent in another circle. I might put English teacher in another circle. I might put woman in another circle. And then students would break into pairs. And while they're in pairs, there's 4 specific things that they would be asked to do. One of them is share a story about a time when you were especially proud of yourself with one of the identities. The second one would be share a story about a time when it was especially painful to be identified as one of those identifiers or descriptors in the bubbles. The third one would be name a stereotype associated with one of those groups. And then the fourth one would be to share a discussion of that stereotype with a specific, you can't see it on this screen, people who have the handout can see it, with a specific sentence starter. So for example, I am blank, but I am not a blank. And just to share ways that this came across in a classroom from a class that I did this with, I had students this semester who did this activity, and they came up with really interesting discussion points that could then become larger assignments, not just in English classes, but in other classes. They filled that in with things like, I am a community college student, but I'm not here because this was my only choice. Or, I am a worker at Taco Bell, but I do deserve a livable wage. And these were students in an English 89 class. I had one student who said, I am African American, but I do believe in marriage. And so they really brought out stereotypes that could lead to larger discussions. Again, not just in an English class, but I could see ways that you could work some of these discussions in a sociology class or a political science class or a math class. And so I think that when we think about the multicultural identities that come into our classroom and we listen to our students, it makes for more engaged classrooms that still allow us ways to meet the objectives of whatever class we were in. So a lot of my research when I was working on my doctoral degree was focused on culturally relevant, culturally sustaining pedagogy, like I'm talking about here. And so from my own research, I saw an increase comparing classes where I did not teach with this kind of pedagogy to classes where I did teach with this kind of pedagogy. And so I saw big increases in students who attended through the end of semester, big increases in students who passed my classes, and big increases in their skill levels. And that was a few semesters ago, and I'm still seeing those kinds of increases in my classes. So I've had students, I always ask at the end of the semester for students to talk about what worked and what didn't work in the classroom. And some of the statements that I hear, and now even without prompting, some of the statements that I hear is that the students are engaged in the class and continue to come to the class because they are talking about things that matter. That if we don't deal with stereotypes, they become the truth, and that stereotypes rob people of their dignity. Because we also talk about culture from a strengths-based perspective, that they enjoy confronting those stereotypes because, to use their words, there's more than the illusion. There are things to be celebrated. I had one student in an 89 class who, when he arrived at my class, he barely had literacy skills. And on our pre-test, he was just copying sentences from the article that he was supposed to be responding to. He couldn't really write his own sentences. And by the end of the semester, he was asking for homework. Like, he was asking to be able to write about issues that he cared about. And so this was a student who not only learned how to write enough to move on to the next level, but wanted to write about issues that he cared about. This semester, I have a student in one of my 102 classes, and he was talking about in class with another student that the reason that they're not on their phones, and they're not on their phones unless we're using them to look up information, but they were talking about the fact that the reason no one's on their phones in the class is because they're learning about stuff that matters to them. And that's really the key with culturally relevant teaching and culturally relevant, culturally sustaining teaching. It doesn't mean that you're teaching only a particular kind of culture based on who's in your classroom. It means that you are learning about the multifaceted identities of who is in your classroom, and you're teaching in a way that matters and that they care about, and you're using that knowledge to reach the objectives of whatever classroom you're in. And so with that, I'm going to let Rachel come up and talk about what she does in her classes.
Okay, hello, my name is Rachel Griffo, and I am a full-time faculty member in English and EAL here at Allegheny campus. I've entitled the presentation Academic English Writing Towards Transformative Inclusion and Transparency. And I like to use Raj Katru. I like to use his concentric circles when I start to talk about English use. Katru is a linguist. I think he taught at the University of Illinois. He passed away maybe 5 years ago. And there's an illustration that I'll come to, but to explain it first, when we talk about inner circle, those are English dominant speakers. So the US, speakers from the United States, speakers from the UK, Ireland, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, they have been using English in a similar way to how it is used in the United States for a long time. Outer circle countries they were colonized by the inner circle. So their use of English is slightly different. Usually it's characterized by British English, and we know that the spelling and structure of British English is different from the way we spell things and the way we structure texts in the United States. Expanding circle countries have not had as much exposure to English, so there's a lot of local varieties that are being used, and it doesn't mean that students who are coming from expanding circle countries speak no English at all. That's not correct. They do speak English, it's just that they haven't had a lot of education in the same way that we have had education in what we call standard English. So most of our multilingual students here at CCAC are coming from expanding circle countries. We have some students that do come from outer circle countries, and then once in a while we do get students from inner circle countries. So I'm talking specifically about multilingual students. These demographics come from institutional research, so 65% of our visa students, it is limited to only visa because we don't really have data on students who are not visa students. These students are from expanding circle countries, 34% are from outer circle countries, and 1% are from inner circle countries. So this is why we have courses like EAL, so that we can support these students. Transformative inclusion, as defined by CCAC, is seeking out, listening to, and respecting the perspectives of all students, fostering an environment conducive to student success and completion, and a focus on the importance of respect that recognizes and appreciates the talents, skills, and backgrounds and perspectives of every individual. It's slightly abbreviated, but this is the definition. This is how we define it here. There is an agent structure challenge. So when we're talking about standardized English in any class, not just English, any of our disciplines we're familiar with, we want students to write using standard English, whether we have them using APA format, or maybe it's more science-based or humanities-based. Regardless, we use that language, standard English. And what I have realized, and I submit that students don't know what that is. I've asked students, what is standard English? And what they say sometimes to me, if they are from expanding circle countries, or even outer circle countries, is, oh, that's, when you use thee and thy, it's very beautiful, and they're thinking of Old English or Shakespeare's English. And I said, no, that's, and I tell them that's Old English, that's not what standard English is. But what is standard English? They'll say correct English. Well, what does that mean? What does that look like? And they can't really answer that question. So a lot of what I have been doing with students that I teach in my multilingual courses in EAL and in English 101, which is a diverse mix of students coming from a variety of backgrounds, is to say, these are the features of standard English writing. It's typed, there's spatial features, it's word processed, it's recognized globally. It's used globally for business and for professional reasons. It's edited. We could even substitute standard English for edited English. And then it starts to become a little bit more clear the work that needs to be done to produce a standard English text. But we could also use these discussions as a point of diversity and inclusion, because there are local varieties of English everywhere. So the local includes the global too. Like here in Pittsburgh, there's Pittsburghese. And students who are from Western Pennsylvania, when they write in their texts, I will sometimes see, and we hear this with our colleagues and with each other, we hear Pittsburghese. And those aspects of those local varieties, those need to be edited just as much for standard English as someone coming from Sri Lanka or someone coming from India. I have to edit my writing to take out my accent from my speech when I produce standard English texts. So creating a discussion about this makes everyone realize that no one's really better off. I've even had students in certain sections of English 101 say, well, I speak correct English. And it's like, okay, so what does that mean? Like, what does that mean you speak correct English? I mean, I speak it the way it's supposed to be spoken. And verbal is different from written. We know this too. We know that we want students to have agency to be able to express themselves the way that they want to. And we can have discussions about ways we can do that in our verbal speech, and also maybe even embed academic texts with those kinds of varieties intentionally. But then there's the issue of attuning to the academic structure. And that needs to be really transparent, regardless of what discipline students are writing in. So when I use the term academic English, I'm talking about standard English. Calling it academic English was another way to try to be transparent about the fact that I'm not talking about, Elizabethan English or any other kind of local English that students may have learned in other contexts. So call it academic English, edited English, standard English, I mean the same thing. So rhetorical attunement this is a phrase that's used to talk about how genres, showing students examples of the kind of writing they're going to be asked to produce. And this can happen in any discipline. If we have models, showing students the models is a good idea so that they can attune their writing to it. Having ongoing discussions about the differences and conventions of academic English and world English. When I say world English, I mean the local varieties around the globe. There's differences. And we like those differences, and it's nice to talk about them. But when we're talking about writing in the context of the university, we want them to edit it for standard English. Use of and attunement to the technology that is used for producing these texts. We know from research that computers and word processing is one of the major barriers that stands between multilinguals and being able to produce this writing. Partly because we teach writing in the United States differently than it's taught anywhere else around the globe. Even in Europe, they do things differently. Composition as a course is not even taught in Europe. Writing is taught differently. So these aspects of producing standard English need to be taught. Responsibilities as language writing teachers in any discipline, providing resources for students, being a voice for students, and recognizing the material and discursive structures that disadvantage them, and advocacy. And that, sorry, this is a bit abbreviated from a previous presentation, that I will finish. Thank you.
So yeah, okay, so we're gonna open up to questions. Sorry, I said so weirdly. Does anyone have any questions for anyone, or is Samana gonna present as well?
You can stop sharing.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But you
Okay.
can still put fun out for
I'm gonna stop sharing. We can have some questions as we get Samana. Ms. Rosette's set up. Does anyone have any questions right now? You can unmute yourself and ask.
Hello. The last one where you were saying the attunement for technology. So I'm still a little confused as to what the issue is and what do we do?
Technology. So when I was talking about technology, what I was referring to is word processing. And I mean, many students who are coming from areas where maybe they didn't have computers, they didn't have Microsoft Word, Blackboard, experience with Blackboard. These are barriers that stand in the way of them producing the kind of texts that we want them to produce. So teaching that, or, I mean, it's necessary to include, you know, Microsoft Word processing in all courses and providing models for students to be able to do that.
Did that answer your question?
Yes. The other question is you were saying about how in Europe they do it differently. That
Yes.
They don't do. So, I mean, everywhere else, basically. What do you mean by, how do they teach that so different from us, or how do we do it?
I know that the structure of the essays that they produce is different. I mean, here in the US, we use a deductive format for producing argumentative texts. And what I mean by deductive is that, you know, at the very beginning, we say like what the point is. We have a thesis, we have a position, and then we expand on it, we come back to it. In Europe, the structure is slightly different from that, and in other language systems, in just for example, Chinese, Hindi, Japanese, they're using inductive formats, right? So that means they start off very broad, and then they get, I mean, their thesis statement maybe doesn't come until the end of the document. So talking about those differences helps students understand they need to place those position statements in a different spot in their paper than they're used to.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
When I was in the UK as well, I found that, as she said, it's not so much that they taught writing, it's that they would give examples of writing. Like you were given a huge reading list. And then as you read, you were asked to mimic other people's writings depending on the field that you were in or what you were doing. And I think Elizabeth can speak to that as well.
Yeah, they don't teach composition in British.
No.
It's just, if you major in English, you just take literature classes.
Right, yeah.
But what I was gonna actually just kind of build on what Megan was saying, a lot of, in different countries as well, plagiarism isn't really a thing.
I was gonna say that.
Yeah, so that is another issue that we really have to be aware of, particularly with international students, that they understand what plagiarism is, they understand how it works in the United States. because the penalties for that can be pretty heavy.
Right.
In fact, I've already gone.
Students coming from Southeast Asian countries.
Oh, huge.
Yeah.
Students coming from the former Soviet
Right.
area.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Samana said the Southeast Asian countries and also former USSR countries, that it just, plagiarism just doesn't exist.
you're taught.
On the computer,
Yeah.
it's free information.
Yeah,
It's
right.
usable as-
If you
I
can
know
find
that-
it, you can use it.
In Turkey, my flatmate in Britain for a long time was Turkish, and she said that you were trained to, when you use an expert's words, you're paying them respect. You're supposed to do that. And the same kind of citation rules are not applied, at least at lower levels of education. So that's something to be really aware of. I've actually modified my own plagiarism policy because I have so many students who are plagiarizing and not aware of it.
Yeah.
So that, they have to, if they plagiarize the first time, there's not really a penalty except they have to rewrite their paper to get a grade.
To unplagiarize it.
Yes, unplagiarize But,
Please unplagiarize it.
but if you look at the student handbook, it just says first time they do it, they get a 0 on the
Right.
paper, which is a heavy penalty for someone who does not even know what they did.
And we have another hand here at Allegheny. Did you have a question?
So do you have any exercises? Because when I have my students write up from a miniature lab report, I do have a particular format. I give them a template, I even give them examples, and they still have a hard time following that pattern.
Yeah.
So I understand between inductive and deductive. Do you have any ideas on how to treat the students? Because even though I feel I'm explaining it, I feel I'm providing them examples, it doesn't come through.
Did everyone hear that question, or should I repeat it? I'm going to repeat a little bit anyway. So the question is, even sometimes, and we all experience this, sometimes even if you give the student a very clear and specific template for what you want them to do, you do not receive that, right? You ask for it, and you do not receive it. And then the question was, are there any exercises or any kind of specific recommendations that either of our presenters would have to help with that issue?
I think that it is, and I might not, this is what I do right now currently, and I'm always looking for better ways to do it, but it is different, I have noticed, providing students with a model and saying, okay, when you write your paper, adhere to this model. I like to have them, and I do, all my courses are web-based, so I have things on Blackboard, but I'll put the model on Blackboard, and then I ask them to look at the self-evaluation form for their first paper, read the model, and then on Blackboard critique it for how well it follows the model, for how well the model is following the self-evaluation. So they almost have to evaluate a model.
They grade themselves.
Yeah.
So I did that for the first time this semester on the second lab report. I did that. I said, here's my example. Now I want you to analyze my work and your work. But again, the trouble I have is I tell them in the template, this is your scientific paper, so we want to start by answering the question. The solution is acidic to your first statement, then explain. And invariably, they'll stick it at the end.
Still not happy.
Yeah, an essay composition.
Yes, that is.
One thing, I don't know if you have like a session where you talk about it, discuss it at any point, like here's,
For an hour.
yeah, okay. So, what sometimes I find helpful when I can't get it across to them and they just keep like persisting with this habit that makes no sense. Ask them, like, well, okay, so how would you do a lab report? How did you do it in high school? Or why do you put the thing here? Actually get them to think about what they're doing. Sometimes that just to draw their attention to it.
So part of the other challenge is oftentimes I'm teaching the night course. They're already trained by the hours.
Yeah.
And they really can't come in early, they can't come in late. I really don't have a chance to have that one-on-one discussion. So
Well, I do it the whole class. When it's essay composition, like if we talk about plagiarism or something, well, why, so if I have a bunch of international students who maybe are from countries where they haven't learned about plagiarism at all.
So I was like, yeah, this has nothing to do with it. Doesn't seem to have any barriers as far as international.
Okay. Well, yeah, but if you can still do it with, anyone, to ask them like, well, okay, so why, I see when you're writing your lab report, you put the answer at the end of it. Is that how you guys did it in high school? How did you do lab reports in high school?
Why did you do it?
Talking, and if they're talking, then they might think.
Right.
Can you prep them a little bit? This evening, we're going to bring up some other topics prepared to come with your opinions and ideas regarding that? I know it's not as organic, the discussion. But
Yeah.
I find that my
Prepare them a
students
little
like to
bit.
talk a lot.
Yeah,
And
I
usually
like-
they're older and they just don't give
You
it.
write, sometimes you write things down.
So, and it's here.
This kind of intentionality is very, I mean, I think this is what we're getting at, that we want them to think about intentionality, that whether you put it on Blackboard and you ask them to be intentional there, that can be very nice for an outside of the classroom thing, although again, there's computer barriers, or, you know, whether or not, like as Samana said, you prime them and you put it on your syllabus, or you even just write it, you know, on the board today, 1, we're going to talk about this, 2, we're going to talk about this, not just that kind of thing. And show them you're being intentional, and then ask them for the same kind of intentionality back. A lot of our students, I mean, in high school, they have the Reach toothpaste commercial idea that you open someone's brain up and you just boop, 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 right? Like pour in the knowledge, as opposed to the fact that this is something they're intentionally supposed to be doing. So that's a good, I think we're all saying that, right? Is that what we're saying?
Just from an advising perspective with the international students and computers,
Yeah.
I'm wondering if students who test into the lowest level of EAL, maybe it shouldn't be a co-requisite to the CNC 100, or is that already?
Well, there's a lot. So
someone's already died on.
we're addressing, these issues are being addressed in larger ways in various places. We have discussed having a CIT placement test, for example. We have definitely discussed that in many levels and in many ways. For you to decide a co-requisite like that, that's your department. I mean, if you guys all came together and decided that you were going to have a co-requisite of a CIT class.
It's not my department.
Oh, for EAL,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
But for ENG,
For English,
right, then you can do that. Put it through governance.
What's going on in CIT 100? It probably has a lot more rating than you realize.
Right.
Yes.
One thing that would be very beneficial for us to do policy development, resource development around issues for EAL students, we need to get the numbers. Because right now, we
Yes.
can only capture those visa numbers, the F1 visa numbers, because that information is required. Most of the other information regarding students is optional. So we're not capturing the amount of students that are here that have these issues for us to put in some real resource and support services. And this has been an ongoing issue. because we have EAL students that have been here for 20 years that are green card holders, that are citizens,
Absolutely.
that still have EAL issues. So so if you're seeing it in the classroom, an increase of student populations, you need to notify us, whether it's my office, the provost, then we can have intentional discussions about support services and things of that nature. This has been a discussion I've been having with senior administration for years, but traditionally, community college did not have the infrastructures to support international students, and there was a very local focus for community colleges, community. But what's happening now, even if we are not actively recruiting international students, they're coming to us because this whole area is marketed internationally by Pitt, by CMU, by all the other colleges. And once they get here, they realize, because they're self-payers much more now than being supported by their governments or supported by industry, they realize it's much more cost-effective to start here and start my acculturation assimilation
Absolutely.
at CCAC before I transfer to a CMU. Well, Roche sends them directly to us and says, you can't afford the road, go to CCAC. Yet we don't have the infrastructure to support them. So it's but the only way I can put things into place or really go to the board and say, this is what we need, is if we see numbers. Because all they're seeing are those visa numbers, which is a very small population.
Correct.
So let us know what you're seeing in your classroom.
Audrey.
Whenever you're talking about implementing technology, you always have to remember that the limited number of computer suites I need to negative amount. And you're going to and we also have limited number of classrooms, which is something I think that's going to happen when you try to implement the college orientation class.
Right.
So we're always limited by our physical resources. I'm not saying that there isn't money there, but the fact of the matter is, it's one thing to talk about having computers for a particular group, which is wonderful and it should happen, but we're talking about it as a reality.
Thank you for reminding me. That's on my list this semester, is to start chasing the powers that be for computer cards for the English department.
Ooh, cards.
Technology has
They
them.
want a larger international
freshmen. I want some for us.
It's not, and it's not even the.
Really, thank you. I want us to be able to wheel them into a classroom. We're going to have a composition day.
Right.
And then someone else can take them the next day.
Yeah. High school does it.
Also needs to review all of the technology that's available now for things such as this. It's not just even the equipment, it's what we're purchasing, what we can make available. Do you know there's accent reduction software?
Yes.
Out there. And for some of our international students, it is not their knowledge of English, it is not their ability to process English. It's like things like accents that's so difficult when they go into, say, a clinical rotation and trying to communicate with people. It's not so we have things out there now we could really identify that would assist all these populations. But it has to be, again, very intentional, very focused. But again, if I don't show the number of the amount of need, I can't.
And then also, I mean, so you mentioned accent reduction, which I think is very useful to students who specifically want that. But then I have students who I would never mention that because to them it's an identity thing.
Yeah,
absolutely. But it's very effective in specific areas.
Yeah. Someone's having problems communicating.
It's very effective in specific areas because the international population is very different than it used to be. There's no such thing as come and totally assimilate. You are now retaining your culture of origin, as well as trying to assimilate enough to be effective in the workforce here. So it's for really targeted reasons. It wouldn't be about your day-to-day language and your communication in a social setting, or it's about because there's a lot of pride in retaining your culture of origin. It's very different than the turn of the century immigrants that are coming over. But it's for how effective can you be in the workplace? How effective can you be in higher education, whatever it may be. It would be very targeted, and of course it would be based upon interest and based upon, it would never be something that would be mandatory. That's ridiculous.
Yeah. I was going to say, this kind of fits with what Sumana was saying. I love your research, Rachel, in your presentation. It's always really interesting to me. And I think that it is applicable just outside of the EAL classroom as well.
Yes.
And where it kind of intersects with Angela's work too, I think, is we need to talk more about code switching in our classrooms with our native English speakers. And again, that shifting between conversational English, the kind of English that you use in different social situations versus the English that you use in the classroom or in the workplace or in a paper. And that's something I think we all need to do more in our classrooms.
And be really transparent about standard English. And I'm to blame too. For a long time teaching English, I said, I would explain the assignment and then I would say, and of course, standard English. And
they're like, the what?
It's a given, but they really don't, try it. Ask students sometime, what is standard English?
Even native speakers.
Yeah, I've done this in English 101, 102. They don't really know.
Right.
I've had them ask, ask me, why does this matter?
Right.
Why do I have to pay attention to all these grammar rules, and why does this, the definition matter? And again, if you explain it to them, I think they pay a lot more attention, because you need to be understood around the country. If you want to communicate with someone who doesn't understand the insert.
Well, it's also
relatable.
But if we all agree to speak
relatable.
this generic English in certain situations, we can all communicate with each other.
But the switching, I think that's really important too, because sometimes when I explain it about different clubs. I hate to say it, right? If you want to get into certain clubs, then you have to be able to walk the walk and talk the talk to be a part of that. Otherwise, you'll always be seen as an outsider. So, that's not the nicest way to think about it.
Yeah, but that's what language does. It includes people and it
excludes people.
It should be a part of a larger discussion about acculturation and assimilation in an effective way. It should be a part of the onboarding process. If we're getting an increase of students, there should be onboarding of students like a college 101, but regarding the acculturation and assimilation.
But even our native students. So many of our native students do not feel like they're part of an academic culture that is not part of their identity.
Well, that's not a college.
I think that's where it's really important for us to think about how we present things. To go back to using the term standard English or academic English. A lot of students still come in with the idea of proper and
yes,
hierarchy.
proper.
Being able to talk about how language is also something that's fluid, and how there is, we don't text in academic English, like Dr. Junior program.
Except for that guy.
Or how we, how there's different Englishes that we choose to use when we're hanging out with our friends as compared to when we're writing our essays or writing our case studies. The English that we might use for a formal essay is different than the English that you might use specific to a case study.
Correct.
Like how there's all these different types. And so, I think all of that goes back to having this sort of strength-based perspective in the classroom when you have these conversations about, and that goes back to code switching. We do it all the time, and we do it in 1,000 different ways, and not all of it is hierarchical. Some of it is, but some of it is that this is how we navigate all the different places that we are in the world.
Yeah. Yes, they need to be reminded they already do it pretty well.
Yeah, I like to do that a lot. I like to inform students. I'm like, you're already doing this.
You don't talk the same way at your grandma's house that you do with your friends or with your boss.
Yeah, like you said, come at it from an asset model, not a deficit model.
Okay. So
that's a huge.
It says difficulty hearing people in the back of your room speaking. So we've been talking about code switching. In other words, the way that different people speak in different ways depending on to whom they are speaking, right? So that, as Elizabeth has just said, you're going to speak differently to your grandma than you are going to be speaking when you're in the club with your friends. And we've also been spending quite a bit of time talking about ways in which to make sure this is not hierarchical necessarily, that we're not saying that there's proper English versus improper English, but there are different ways to speak English in different situations which are appropriate to each one, and that even within academics, that can be very different. So the way that you would write for an essay for an English class is going to be very different than the way that you would write for an essay for a biology class or a biology report in that kind of way. And if we all as instructors come together and make that intentional and say that to our students, no matter what it is we are teaching, then maybe they'll get that idea. So did I sum that up good? Well, sorry. Was that a good sum?
And Carlton is a great example of someone who can't code switch. Carlton, like if you ever want to, everybody always knows the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, even though that show is really old now for our students. But yeah, Carlton is a great example of someone who can't code switch, and they get that. And but it's just reversed because he can't talk like the other kids.
Right.
And he sounds stilted and old
and old and white. Yes. So there are many examples, I'm sure, that we've come across that we can use from our personal lives or that we can use from our students, or our students can share. I really like the questions that Angela had for the students.
Yeah, I just want to go back to the numbers.
The numbers.
Students.
Yes.
Because I think there are certain mechanisms or ways that we can use to get these numbers, at least going beyond the baseline numbers. Because most of the students in our classrooms are not even these students. So if we go with the EAL students who are registered in those classes
or self-identified.
See, that's another problem.
We can get more students in that category. And also English teachers always say, like, I think we have students here who need to be in EAL. They would also be a good resource to give us more numbers.
We have to present that information in an equitable way, gather that, because we can't make assumptions. Even if we feel like somebody is, just like with disability, we might think a student has a disability, we can't make that assumption. We can give resources though. Like you can even on your syllabi, especially in EAL courses, put some kind of a disclaimer in there. For further development and resource development for EAL students, please identify it, whether English is your first language or not, or whatever it may be. Yes, we can have some targeted questions that help us gain that information. Because sometimes people will not. People will not. Yeah. My mother's been here for 45 years and still has a very strong accent. And to her, I speak English perfectly. She will not identify as having any.
Sumana,
And that happens a lot too with.
do we have any questions on when we do admissions? And obviously this would be something to speak about with Kristen, about which languages you most identify with. Do you know what I mean? Like some people, like, do you only speak one language in your home? Do you speak two languages in your home? Like that kind of stuff.
That'd be a look at that.
That'd be a good place to gather information.
Of course, we have the race and ethnicity, but let me tell you, we have such an underreporting percentage. People do not.
They don't fill those out. But maybe they would with
Especially the younger
language.
generations, because they did not grow up in a time of affirmative action. They don't see the need for those questions. They don't understand what those questions are all about. And as I was going to say in my presentation, the new generation, the Gen Z, will be the most racially and ethnically ambiguous generation ever than any other generation in our history. So for them, those questions are absolutely antiquated.
Right.
They'll represent them.
Yeah. Do you want to do your presentation? If there are no other questions, let's have Sumana actually do her presentation. That was a fabulous segue.
Do you have how much time?
You have till 4 o'clock.
Yeah.
So you have about 40 minutes.
Okay, so I'm going to share the screen now. And then I'm going to start Sumana's presentation.
We'll talk about Gen Z. So those are our traditional students coming in.
Yeah, so here's the microphone and there's the camera. So if you want to present, like they'll be able to see you and the presentation if you want to. And I can flip whenever, you can just like wave it.
I'll get them.
Are you sure? Okay.
Even though
they can't see you now.
See me behind
Yeah,
us.
now they can see you.
Okay. For those of you that are administrators in the classroom, I just presented to the administrators regarding these kinds of issues. What I wanted to preface my presentation with is I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of diversifying pedagogy, diversifying and knowing how to manage a more diverse classroom. The reason is because the demographics of our student population is changing dramatically. And I want you to understand why you need to be motivated to diversify. I want to come back and do a whole nother presentation on how to apply these things into your portfolio, into your course outlines, into your syllabi, all of that. Because that is a much larger discussion, because it's not that easy to do that unless you, again, intentionally make an effort to do it. And it stems around something called cultural competency. The more culturally competent you become, the more naturally you will diversify your curriculum and have a different mindset to your pedagogy. Okay? So, but it takes intentionality, it takes practice, it takes a real understanding that it's not just about cultural sensitivity any longer. It's not just about understanding that there's difference. It's about cultural competency, where you see the value of that difference and working to promote that difference. So there's a real difference in even the language that we're going to be using regarding diversity. It's not about diversity anymore. Diversity is here. It's a reality of the world, and we'll talk about that. It's about inclusion and cultural competency. That's the new direction of the conversation around diversity. Okay? So I want to start with a little quiz here. Let's start with your own, and those of you that are administrators in here, you know the answers to these questions. One thing also about diversity and inclusion is it is a living thing. It changes constantly. This can't be a one-time shot kind of discussion. These need to be ongoing conversations, because what diversity was 10 years ago, that's not what diversity is today. It's constantly changing. So if you take a look at this, let's have a little bit of interactive fun. If I were to ask you, what is the largest minority group in the country right now, what would you say? They might be the most vocal, but hopefully they're not the most. Okay.
The largest minority, I'd probably say Asian.
Okay.
I'd say Latino.
Okay.
Are we talking about ethnicity or?
Oh, small child.
Say that again. Largest.
Largest. Yeah, I'm back there. I'm like,
Okay. If you don't learn anything else today, let's expand our definition of diversity. If you don't learn anything else today, what did Elizabeth just ask me?
Are we only talking about ethnicity?
Okay. What is the largest minority group in the country? I didn't say ethnic or racial minority, did I?
Yeah,
It's individuals with disabilities. Almost 38% of the population are individuals with documented disabilities. Okay? The word minority itself is changing because it's a pejorative term. Okay? It should be now underrepresented populations. So if you don't learn anything else today, expand your vision of diversity. That it is inclusive, especially in the context of higher education and the populations that we serve. It is inclusive of way more than race, ethnicity, gender, all of our old views of diversity. It's much more expansive. Now, there is that question here. What is the fastest growing ethnic minority group in the country? So you're more culturally competent than you think you are, Elizabeth.
We know that.
What is that? Is Hispanic Latino.
Yeah.
Hispanic Latino. Keep this in mind, by the year 2042, and it was 2050, so it's moving faster now. This is moving faster now, and it's going to probably move even faster. There will be no ethnic and racial majority in the country. By the year 2042. I have a feeling that's going to change dramatically in the next few years. It's going to come down to 2040, 2035, it'll be in our lifetime, potentially, that there will be no majority racial group in the country any longer. People of color will outnumber. Okay? So that's one of the big trends why we have to diversify how we're doing things. Because that old style didactic teaching ain't gonna work anymore. Okay? How many generations are represented? Let's do this one. How many generations are represented in the CCAC student population? How many generations?
At least 3.
Yeah,
4 or 5.
Yeah, 5. Yes.
For the first time in our history, there are 5 generations in the active workforce. We've always had more representation of generations at CCAC, but now we have 5. Everything from the traditionalist generation, you can have a 15-year-old and a 70-year-old in the same classroom. Okay? The area or dimension of diversity that is impacting CCAC more than any other today is generational diversity and classroom management because of generational diversity. And we'll talk about that in
Someone have a question? I think somebody needs to mute their phone. Sorry, I can't do it on my laptop. Sorry.
Just have a whole set of hygiene.
Anyone have a question for Samana?
College 101.
No. All right, somebody does need to mute their phone because we can't hear them. I can try and do it. There we go.
That should do it.
Okay. So we talked about the fastest growing ethnic and minority group is Hispanic Latino. And again, it's an ethnicity, not a race. You can be African and Hispanic, right? Caucasian and Hispanic. Okay, people change that. Does everybody know what the acronym LGBTQAI and many more, there's many more letters to that acronym stand for? And plus, yeah, usually plus. Okay, we're going to talk about the growing population of people self-identifying and what that comes with as well. Are veterans a recognized group under the diversity spectrum? Did you have a question, Dawn?
Sorry.
Intersex. Intersex? I is intersex. I is intersex. Q is questioning or queer. Okay. Reclaim that word, and we even have now 7, I just created 7 new gender identities for our Aleutian group, in Aleutian. The students can go in and select the identity, and we have gender queer in there. We have binary, non-binary. We just created gender neutral pronouns as well, Z and they. So they can go in there and select that as well. And you know our chosen name policy.
Is it ally or asexual? Oh,
It's both.
It's both. Most of these, have more than one.
Yeah.
And the T is transgender. People are not transgendered. They're transgender. A lot of people mistake that. Okay? And we have many, 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 many more. This new generation, Generation Z, is also the most gender fluid generation that we've ever had. Okay? So the words that you're going to be hearing in the classroom, the way people self-identify in the classroom, all of that is changing.
Answer the veterans one.
Oh, are veterans a recognized group under the diversity spectrum? Yes.
Oh, they are?
Yes. There are also some legal, they're not necessarily under the civil rights legislation, but they are recognized in other ways, especially in employment, areas of employment, as an underrepresented population. Okay? So and we have a growing number of veterans. Okay? I'll talk to you about the trends in a second. We all know the dimensions of diversity. That's what those things are, the dimensions. Again, the dimension impacting us the most is generational diversity right now. That in itself could be a whole presentation, because what does that bring with it? We'll talk about that. It brings with it, again, different learning styles, different communication styles, different abilities with technology, all of that. And it impacts management in the classroom. Okay. Now, diversity in higher education means a lot more, because it's about looking at the demographics of the students and the faculty. It's about looking at inclusive curriculum. It's about looking at contributions, making an intentional effort, again, being intentional to look at information from marginalized groups and make sure you're inclusive of that in your curriculum and information. Okay. There's a business case for diversity strategy in higher education. Remember this, we are preparing our students for a global workforce, not regional, not state, not national, global. They need to know how to interact effectively. They need to have a level of cultural competency that will make them effective in the world. Part of just CCAC, I just want to break this down a little bit. There was a lot of support top down from making issues of diversity part of our mission statement, part of our value statement, part of our strategic goals and objectives. But they can't just be statements. We have to put them into action and make them effective. Okay? But at least a lot of schools aren't as intentional in this process. And there's a reason why we did this. I'll tell you that reason in a second, but I want you to be familiar. There's a reason why our non-discrimination policy is as comprehensive as this, where we see not even just gender identity, but perceived gender identity. Because this is who we serve. We increase this, we expand this, because we know that these populations are within our student demographics. They need to be recognized, they need to be included. It's a very inclusive statement comparatively to a lot of institutions because we have such a diverse population. My office is the Office of Institutional Diversity and Inclusion. Our goal is to be at the substantive level, looking at policy of equity for the institution, looking at inclusion in the institution, making sure things are equitable. Remember, equal is not equitable. As an institution, we have to have rules and regulations about equal treatment, but sometimes that doesn't mean it's equitable, because different populations have different needs. A one policy model doesn't always meet the needs of all of the different populations we serve. Okay. Look at the student profile. Couple things to keep in mind. Why this is so important in the classroom. Why this is so important in academia. We have the largest percentage of students that self-identify as an ethnic or racial minority of any regional institution, especially the domestic minority population. CMU might have a diverse population, but it's international students that are much larger than their domestic minority population. Largest of any institution in the region. Our student percentage of individuals with documented disabilities is the largest of any regional institution. Largest population of any regional institution. And that population is growing dramatically, especially on the autism spectrum issues. Okay. Look at that, international students, which are the visa students, we might have about 100, 150, and you know there's hundreds more that have these needs. That's why I need as much insight to who we have here as you can give me. Okay. One thing about average student age, 28, we're going to talk about real quickly about what is a non-traditional student. It is just not age defined any longer. Okay? A non-traditional student, for example, we can have traditional age students that lead non-traditional lifestyles. They might be parents, they might be single support, they might be their own, they might be financially independent from their parents. They might be working part-time, full-time. So non-traditional, the majority, they say by 2020, almost 40% of all college entrants will be non-traditional by some factor. So it's not just age defined any longer. The 5 generations that are represented in our student population now. Elizabeth, did you have a question?
Oh, yeah, she doesn't like being millennial.
No, I'm not. Every different provider of this information has different time frames. Okay, has different time frames. And where you are on the time frame, like I'm Generation X, but I was born in '68. Sometimes I feel much more like a baby boomer than a Gen Xer. So it really depends on where you are on that continuum, and there's a lot of these different time frames that are different. Okay? But because of this management in the classroom, sometimes we get issues which is a classroom management issue, not a conduct issue, not a disruption of teaching issue. It's a management issue because there's confusion over student needs, things of that nature. The biggest thing for faculty to keep in mind is you have to diversify your teaching modality. You got to be a lot more flexible in what works in the classroom. It's not about changing who you are, but understanding who you are teaching to. The younger populations have a very different mindset towards education than older populations do. In older generations, okay, and I hate generalizing, but in older generations, higher education was a privilege. The way they looked at higher education was it was a privilege. Not everybody got that opportunity. Younger generations feel it's a right. They are much more the first ones to say, I'm paying your salary. So change it up, because I'm not getting it. Okay? It's not about disrespect. It's not about, their expectations are different. Their training has been different. Their needs are different. Think about it, this Gen X, these generational characteristics are critical to understand. Gen Z is a very different generation than Gen Y. We've been at war the majority of their life. They went through major issues because we went through a major recession during their lifetime where they saw their parents impacted, their lifestyles impacted. They're very different than Gen Y. Like I said, most gender fluid generation most racially ambiguous generation, most inclusive generation. Okay? They're a very socially conscious generation. They will come and they are very, very much self-advocates. They will challenge you. And they'll be much more knowledgeable about what they're challenging you with. Okay? And they will ask you to prove them wrong. But the thing is, each generation has a different learning style, has a different communication style. Remember, Gen Y, they've had technology the majority of their life. These people were born with it in their hand. Very different. Education is a 24/7 platform, more than ever before with this generation. But they're much more practical in some ways than Gen Y. They understand boundaries, limits, a little bit more. If on your syllabus you tell them, go ahead and email me, I will return your email within a certain period of time, they can respond to that more effectively. Whereas Gen Y, sometimes it has to be immediate. Give me that feedback immediately. And again, I'm generalizing. Of course, there's individual diversity and intracultural diversity and intragenerational diversity. Okay, but know who's coming into your classroom. So look at these trends here. Minority students, immigrants, and non-traditional students will be the fastest growing segments in higher education student demographics, student population. By 2020, look at this one. 60% of new college entrants will be students of color. 60%. Increase of students who are veterans because, again, the GI Bill will take them a lot farther at a community college than at a four-year institution. 11% of all new college students will be a veteran. And 50% of that 11% will be coming through a community college system. Increase in students with cognitive disabilities and psychological disorders. You will not see disability like you used to. Disability was much more visibly discernible. It will not be any longer. Because of medical technology, physical disabilities are not as prevalent as psychological and cognitive disabilities, which are increasing dramatically. So again, a lot of you know, you might think that somebody's acting a certain way, it's a classroom disruption, it might be a conduct violation, but it might be that it's related to their disability. So it's important to be a lot more cognizant of that, aware of that, and to reach out to the resources that you have that can help you discern that, or help you understand that. Okay. Some more trends. By 2020, projections show that 15 to 18% of total college student population will self-identify. Okay. And 60% of these students by this task force project said that they were still afraid of their physical safety in colleges. Non-traditional students, 40%. That's a huge population. An increase in something, there's a new terminology called third age learner. There are learners from the age of 55 to 79 that are not just coming to school to keep life interesting anymore. Because we used to have a lot of the population taking non-credit courses, ballroom dancing, and wine tasting, and these are, individuals need substantive courses to stay employable, okay? Computer classes, technology classes, to stay competitive in the job market at much older ages because of the lack of resources to retire. And people are living so much longer, of course. Third age learner. Learning style is different, communication's different, access and usage of technology is different. Expectations are different. So classroom management is a huge conversation you need to continue to have And I can give you resources of who can come in and do some classroom management information, because that's going to become a major, major thing that you need to adopt and diversifying of teaching modalities. Those two things are critical. Okay. So in developing what we need to do to meet the needs of a lot of these students is a inclusive classroom, okay? Inclusion, comparatively to diversity, they're two different things. Okay. Diversity, bottom line, diversity is what we have. Inclusion is what you do to make sure that these diverse populations are being retained, are succeeding, and feeling like they are included in this institution. Okay? If you know, the word inclusion historically was about mainstreaming students with disabilities into the everyday classroom. But this has now expanded to say that at CCAC, an open enrollment public institution, everyone belongs here. Unless they do something that violates something that should get them out of here, everybody belongs here, and everybody should feel like they belong here. Okay. It's about understanding in your classroom that everybody's coming to this classroom with some strengths. Everybody's coming with weaknesses. It's like the human thing, but that everybody can make some kind of a positive contribution, and that you need to know how to leverage this. Finding the strengths of your students, finding what works more effectively for them, finding how their learning styles are. Seems hard to do when you have a classroom of 40 students trying to individually understand everyone. But that's why we're going to talk about techniques of how you can make that easier to do next time. Okay. One of the biggest things you can do as an individual in your professional and personal development is assess your own biases. Because for you to promote and to really support something like inclusion, you need to become more culturally competent. We all do, because it's such a fluid thing. Self-assessment is critical in that process. What are the biases you come to the table with? Because we all have it. Okay? What is prejudice, everybody? What's prejudice?
Prejudge.
Prejudge. Okay? When we prejudge according to race, it becomes racism. When we prejudge according to sex, it becomes sexism. But we all have prejudgments from our families of origin, from our life experiences, from things that we have seen and done, life experiences. You have to say to yourself, why am I making these assumptions? And do these assumptions make any sense in my life today? Why have I not gotten rid of them if I had any? Because if you have prejudgment, you're coming to that classroom already potentially that can impact the students disparately. So you have to assess those own things within you. Okay? So self-assessment is the core value in cultural competency. Core value. Inclusive teaching, you can break into two categories. Incorporating diverse perspectives and creating an inclusive classroom climate or environment. Okay? Very simply, and we'll go into much more detail with this in another presentation, you've got to go beyond as a professor to see what kind of course content is out there that is relevant to my discipline, but that can increase, of course, the diversity, the perspective. It doesn't just have to be English. So you assess things, even when you're doing program assessments, assessing the materials that you are using, the text that you are using. Are they utilizing diverse examples? Are they looking at diverse settings? Diverse, you have a math work, It's late in the day, sorry. Okay, you have a math problem, right? Are they saying Bobby coming from where? You know, even the names that are utilized, even the environments that are utilized in the examples, is there some diversification or is it very, very homogeneous? Every discipline you can diversify, just that. You know how a student can relate to a math problem? They'd never, if they hear their name as part of that process, if they, you know, it makes a difference. So looking at things beyond the norm, beyond what's been used for the last 50 years, what's out there now? A great way to do this, look at diverse perspectives, is really connect with diverse colleagues. Really connect, and it doesn't have to, people that are also looking at this, there's best practices out there, and I can provide a lot of resources regarding diversification of curriculum and materials, right? Use all different kinds of representation in your classroom. Use texts from a lot of different types of people with different experiences. And the inclusive classroom climate, it's almost like, and we've talked about this before, it's almost like creating a safe space. It's hard to do that because students are coming to us with their life experiences, especially in K through 12 education, that was not a safe space for them, where they were put down, labeled, all these other things. Trying to create a safe space where everybody feels like they are valued in their voice. They're not going to be told that they're stupid, they can't do something. I have math anxiety from the time I was 12 because I went up to the board and did a math problem and did it wrong. My teacher said, "You're Indian, you should be good at this." I've had math anxiety since then. Buying into those kinds of stereotypes, those kinds of things. Yes, you had a question.
This is a difficult question for you, Simona, but I wanted to ask it. And probably the answer to this might possibly come at another time. But when you talk about creating space for everyone and all views, what is your response to those views that might be white supremacists who are, nurturing discussions like that when they come up? Because to shut that down creates a lot. I haven't experienced it severely in my own life, but it's problematic.
It is problematic, and especially in society right now. With what we have going on, a lot of people feel much more justified to be able to voice those kinds of situations or opinions and ideas. Still have the boundaries in your classroom and establish those boundaries very early on.
Is it okay?
Being inclusive is not being inclusive. You can still have rules and some kind of parameters around inclusion.
If you're espousing white supremacy, you're violating whatever rules you set in place in that classroom to have it be an inclusive space. Right?
That's right. That's right.
I think it's a great opportunity to have a discussion about false equivalence, which is what we usually do.
Right.
In order to set up. They're not the same.
And people forget, and this is something that organizations fight about. All speech is not free speech. Hate speech is not free speech. Okay? So you can. That was a great way to express that inclusion does not include people that are exclusive and speaking exclusionary. So you can create those kinds of parameters because that person can find a space where they can espouse their stuff. Remember, again, we're public open enrollment institution, and a classroom is a public space. So if there's hate speech going on in a classroom, you can limit that within academic freedom, but of course beyond that, within civil rights. Okay.
And also just disagree. In the context of the discussion, I had someone once say, "Well, nobody is more oppressed than white people." Just I think that's true.
Right.
But
the good thing is, remember that at the end of the day, we're educators. Maybe nobody's given that white supremacist a different perspective about things. So hopefully, I have to do presentations on white privilege, and people get so offended. I'm not privileged. That's not literal. It doesn't mean that you have as much, money and resources. people will create a lot of pushback when I use the word white privilege. But it's a way to educate that privilege doesn't mean that. This is where you and I can walk into a space together, and how you are looked at, referred to, observed, assessed is going to be very different than how I am looked at, observed. So if there's an opportunity to educate, that's great. But you can have parameters in an inclusive, safe space. All right. When instructors attempt to create safe, inclusive classrooms, they should consider multiple factors, including the syllabi, course content, class preparation, their own classroom belief system, and their knowledge of a student's background and skills. I really recommend, and I was in the classroom for many years. I really recommend, but it was easier to do because I was teaching psychology courses. But I used to do a needs assessment for students at the beginning of every semester. Okay, whether it be material needs, are you having trouble with transportation, childcare, and it was optional. Nobody was forced to fill it out. But it gave me a perspective of what those students went through just to get to my class every morning. Okay? It gave me much better insight to my students and gave me a better perspective. And then if I could provide resources, I would, right? But do a needs assessment. Doesn't just have to be material needs. Okay? Treat each student as an individual and respect each student for who or she is. That is very difficult to do when you're trying to teach 40 students. But that kind of thing, like that needs assessment, would let me get an individual perspective on each student. Okay. Rectify any language patterns or case examples that exclude or demean any groups. Those are the kind of things you have to be, again, very intentional about. You might have used a certain text for the last 10 years, and all of a sudden you identify some information in there. I had to deal with a case where a student said, I'm in this class, but this text that's being used in this class is very discriminatory against me, or I feel very discriminated against. I looked at the text. I saw how a person could perceive what he was perceiving. He did not feel included in that classroom because of the tenor of that text. So I made recommendations to the professor. Recommendations: take a look at some of these other ways to present this information, because this person is feeling excluded from the conversation because of the personal feelings of this writer, of this author. Because he put his personal beliefs in there a lot. Yeah.
Can you share a little bit of that with us without giving much information? In other words, how and why the student was feeling excluded?
It was actually and again, okay, there's nothing that is reverse racism. Racism is racism, and it can apply to any race. Okay, this was a white student who was taking a culturally diverse class. It was in ethnic studies. This one author didn't just talked about the white race in a very, very negative way. As not just oppressors, but almost as the devil. Okay? So I could see how he personally felt that this is excluding me from this conversation. And a lot of in that discipline, we can have very extremes of thought. But there are a lot of other very good texts and books from wonderful authors that take into consideration looking at equity and looking at all those things. Okay. So yeah, I did find.
But isn't also exposure to those extremes part of the education experience?
Sure.
They might not be ready right away. Maybe not at FCH 101.
Was that book conducive to what the curriculum, there was a lot of other material out there that could have met that need than this that was a very polarizing kind of perspective. They could have talked about that. Let's talk about this author. But should that have been the only maybe text that was utilized in the class? Maybe not. But again, it's recommendations I can give. Okay. Get a sense of how the students feel about the cultural climate in the classroom. We've had a lot of discussions too about those difficult conversations. You know, higher ed is a place where you should be able to have some difficult conversations in the classroom, addressing issues. Don't be afraid to address issues that are challenging, ideas and concepts that are, you know, don't be afraid to address those that are intense, because they do need exposure to that. Absolutely. You know? But understand and be very strategic of how you present it and what you want to do with it. Because you have to dedicate some time and effort to it. You can't just throw it out there and say, you've got to process that. Okay? There's so many, what time is it? I don't want to keep you.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you might want
I'm going to wrap it up.
We'll have you back.
Okay.
Yeah, you have your whole, yeah.
Okay. We will continue to have discussions, but understand the bottom line is our demographics, our student population is changing. It is much more culturally diverse. You are going to see these changes occur in the classroom. And you need to understand the classroom management and teaching styles have to adapt to the changing demographics of our population. What worked 20 years ago will not work in the classroom anymore. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that was very helpful. And there's a lot of things in there that I want to implement. This question is, I'm just going to end every presentation now that we have some OCS over here this way. So our population is growing and changing and getting more diverse, and our jobs are getting more challenging, which I think is a good thing. And I chose this place because of the diversity. However, I have to say it's very frustrating trying to do right by our students as our mission says we intend to. We do not have the resources. So if our population is getting more diverse, we need to look at each of the student as an individual. We need to come to these training sessions. When is the college going to invest in faculty?
Yeah, and diverse faculty.
Yeah,
I also
exactly.
say, okay, guess what? There's a new project through HR where you as faculty members can have an active role in diversifying our faculty. I want you to check it out. We just started going to the academic deans.
Wait, come over here so they can hear you. No, come over here, come here. So she's talking about something new about diversifying faculty, because Elizabeth's question was, how do we get more support?
Because 29% of our student population are ethnic and racially diverse. Only 17% of our faculty population has that same diversity. Now, HR is starting a new program to make faculty active in diversifying our faculty and looking at resources, teaching resources, mentoring resources for faculty. And if you want to get involved, please reach out to Kim Manigault. We're going to be going, we are presenting to the department chairs at all of the different campuses regarding the need of a lot of things, such as new training for faculty, okay? So we're gonna go to the department chairs and you can actively get involved with assisting HR in the diversification of faculty moving forward. Yes.
That means we need more faculty. That's the point. We don't have any control for that. We had a minority intern program 10 years ago. That's how we hired certain individuals.
Yes, we were sued. No, wait. We were sued for that program, and that's why it went away. We could redevelop something. We can redevelop. Yes.
Well, then why weren't we informed?
Because that is an issue that was, you cannot be informed of the details of that situation because it was in litigation. Okay. But believe me, because we oversaw that, right? My office oversaw that
and I guess
process.
What I would say is when you're asked to
perform a task and then you do it, but then you're not given the information. I mean, there's really a problem. with
I know.
transparency.
I know, there is a problem.
Yes, there is. All right,
The
just
need for faculty has been an ongoing issue in this institution. How do we change the demographics there in the sense of the percentages of adjunct to full-time? How do we start doing that?
Hire less six-figure salary administrators, there's more of that money into faculty.
wait. Do we have any more questions about diversity? Is everyone done?
Actually, on the area, that's in the on.
Wait a minute, this is the elephant in the room, and it's not about diversity, it's about this whole money issue, and it really, you can't.
Read it left.
Lump it into a diversity issue, that's not what it is.
Well, I mean, if you want to have people looking at their students as individuals, they have to have been hired not 5 minutes ago and commuted over here for 3 classes in Duquesne that they also teach.
Well, here's one thing though, I want you to know, there's a national shortage. There is a national shortage of individuals that are going into full-time teaching, going into tenure track positions. There's a national shortage. And in diverse populations, there's even a bigger shortage. It's when they become experts in a field, in a discipline, but they're not going into training. They're not going into education, higher education. They're going into business and industry because it's paying more. Right, it's paying more.
Salary
So,
has been a problem. Jane Aston were here. She would talk about how we are unable to keep faculty because of the hiring salary and the maintenance salary. So
that's part of the, is that a negotiated piece of it? Does that need to be?
Bye, everyone.
We can hear stuff.
Bye, thank you, everybody.
There you go.